Welcome to On Fighting in Thailand, the best news and analysis covering the economics and infrastructure of Muay Thai. I'm Matt Lucas, journalist, commentator, and ex-Muay Thai fighter. Make stronger fighters, make stronger people. So in this episode, our second in our series on Australian Muay Thai history, we talked to Darren Riddler Reece from Perth, Australia. He spent a lot of time at the famed Saengmorakot gym in Bangkok. It's right by Rajadamnern Stadium. He spent about 3 years out there and really developed himself as a fighter. It's really interesting hearing about his journey and also what he really brought back to Australia, because I think he really hits home some key points. So without further ado, the interview with Darren Riddler Reece. So how are you doing today? How are things over in Perth?
Hey Matt, how you going? Thanks. Yeah, I'm going well. Things are good in Perth.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a great run of fight shows to finish off last year. We had an early closure in the year here just for 5 days, but things are back up and we've had 2 fight shows in the last 2 weeks. So definitely can't complain compared to what's going on in the rest of the world. We've been very lucky here in Perth.
Yeah, one of the big events you had was the WBC international bout between George Mann and David Panapid from Muay U. Definitely want to talk about that. But first, obviously you've been in this sport for so long. You had a pretty extensive fight career going back and forth between Australia and Thailand, and then eventually staying in Thailand after an international tournament. But could you tell a little bit about how you got started and what the Muay Thai scene was like at the time?
Okay, yeah, cool. Well, I got started in 1989, and back in those days, like most of the people that were involved in Muay Thai and kickboxing and things like that from that early 90s era, got started with the Bob Jones Corporation, and I actually started with a freestyle martial art called Zendokai, and a part of that was sparring and striking and a crude form of Muay Thai back there. They were the first ones to bring in the leg kicking, low kicking from the Muay Thai style. So really got started that way. I was very lucky in that my instructor that I chose to start with happened to be competing. So the school, the gym was very small at that time. Like there was only 3 or 4 or 5 students. It was very early for him. So a large part of our training sessions were sparring and actually practicing to spar and compete. I think I sparred in my first training session ever of Muay Thai. So, that was combined with sometimes it was Muay Thai, sometimes it was street self-defense, sometimes it was kata and patterns and those kinds of things. But like I said, I was lucky in that my instructor was competing, so we sparred more often than not.
And then when did you start fighting, and when did you first start making trips over to Thailand? Because you went on 2 or 3 month stints pretty regularly for a while, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So I came from a competitive sporting background from when I was very young. I did the usual things through school, like playing Australian rules football, soccer, cricket, all those kinds of things. But I was also a competitive swimmer from when I was about 6 years old to 16 or 17. So, in which case, like some of that time, I was, training twice a day, and I represented my state in Australia in swimming, and so I had that competitive thing in me, and I went into triathlons, and then from triathlons I just got into martial art for the self-defense, and being a teenage boy and having wanted to do it for years and years. So that got me into it that way. In terms of edging me towards competing, that was a logical step, my competitiveness taking over, and wanting to test myself more than anything, and doing some back popular in those days was tournaments, some touch contact tournaments that the Bob Jones Corporation used to run, and I did well in a couple of those things that I went to, and so the next test was to want to compete, but that came well after my first trip to Thailand. So I think from reading Blitz magazines, I saw an ad for Stefan Fox's very first Thailand tour. So I went on that. That was 1993. So that was, the very early days of those kinds of things. And Stefan took us all to Koh Samui and places like that where the WMC camp wasn't even established at that stage back then. So yeah, that was my opening to Thailand. I think the tour was almost 3 weeks, and I spent an extra week there as well. And that I got the bug, as anyone that does Thailand experiences, and then it was just working to get back there as soon as you could. And my next trip after that was a 3-month visa, and I went down to Sityodtong in Pattaya and overstayed my visa by a month. So I did 4 months, because back then it was only about 500 baht a day to overstay your visa, so you didn't even worry about extending properly. And so that was the Thailand influence and bug, and that was the beginning of many trips.
And then after that trip to Sityodtong, you moved over to Saengmorakot, correct?
Yes, I did try jockey gym. So after the Sityodtong trip, my best friend back then, Timur Dal, who was into Thailand, even probably a little bit more ahead of me, he was at jockey gym, which is where Dannyville was at that time, and I did go and I tried the jockey gym, but I didn't really like it. I didn't get any attention whatsoever. I was there for nearly a month, and I don't think I got paid work one time with a trainer. And so I thought, maybe that place isn't for me. And on my next trip, I went to Thailand for the IFMA Kings Cup, like Amateur World Championships, and had a tournament. That was 97, 98, and I won that, and I just decided to stay from there. So I contacted Phon Martdee in Perth, because I had a good friendship with him, and he recommended me to go to Saengmorakot, his good friend Jartui, and the rest is history.
And that gym was located by Rajadamnern, correct?
Yes, very close to the Rajadamnern and Golden Mount, Wat Saket.
And you fought at Rajadamnern a few times as well, correct?
Yeah, I had 4 fights, 4 wins at Raja.
And so what was it like at the time period training at Saengmorakot, and what sort of things were happening in Australia at the time?
The training at Saengmorakot was, it was full on. I was tested, I was taken in, I trained like the Thais did, even though my body wasn't prepared for that. But I felt like the best way to get their respect and earn their respect was to train how they trained, and not cut any corners. Do all the runs, do all the rounds. Clinch them. Everything like that. I did everything that I could to fit in and gain their respect in terms of the training, and just simply to do it properly. The training was very, very hard. Firstly, just getting used to that volume of training, and also the gym at that time was Thailand. It was voted Thailand Gym of the Year. I think three out of the 4 years that I was closely associated with it. So I think that pressure to maintain that and there was a lot of champions at the gym at that time. The pressure was on to maintain that standing, and so the training was very, very, very physical. Big runs. Rounds of pads was 5 or 6 5-minute rounds. Clinching was an hour, sometimes more, depending on who was keeping time. They went through stages of running after, a 3, nearly 4-hour training session as well. All kinds of crazy things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Tiring. And
yeah.
How old were you at the time?
At that time, I was, that was me already being in the sport at Saengmorakot, already nearly being in the sport almost 10 years. So I was 18, I think 18, 19 when I started. I think it was about 20. I was 27 or something like that when I won the World Amateur Championships. So yeah, I was like already 28 and stuff like that. I reckon at that time.
I assume you were the only foreigner at the gym, or were the maybe 1 or 2 other people?
Yeah, a large part of the time. I was there on my own, or you sometimes get like a Japanese student come and stay for a little while. One of my best friends, Brett Dalton from Australia, he would come over and train and visit and spend 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 months, and then a vast majority of the time I'd be on my own. It was a really great but full-on experience.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
Sort of back then as well, like there wasn't much English around. It wasn't like going to Phuket or anything like that. We'd speak to them in Thai and they'd speak to you back in English. It was like the area, it was central Bangkok, and it was like I would sometimes go 1 or 2 weeks not speaking any English at all, unless I called home to speak to somebody. I got to the stage where I find myself actually counting reps in Thai and things like that. It's pretty funny at the time.
Yeah,
or afterwards, actually. It's pretty funny afterwards looking back.
That's not surprising at all. Even in my own experience coming over for the first time in like 2005 or so, the amount of integration between Thais and foreigners was not that much. And, this was like early internet days, and I feel like before then, even less. So how often were you fighting? You said you had the 4 fight bouts at Raja, I assume while you were at Saengmorakot.
Yes. I had lots of fights around in the countryside as well. I fought in temples. I fought in Bangkok under freeways. Wherever there were fights I took, I got asked if I wanted to fight that night, sit in the back of the ute and go out in the country and have a fight. I got taken to markets and got a fight found for me. Whatever it was back in those early days to get fights. There was no such thing as Max Muay Thai and all these stadiums sort of set up for TV, and foreigner versus Thai and those kinds of things. It was just doing it, deeply ingrained.
Yeah. And what was your purse like? How were you supporting yourself while you were there?
Just fighting often. I think in a 2-year period, I had almost 30 fights, I remember. Plus, also during that time, I had a couple of fights that spent a short amount of time in Japan, actually. With the late Duke Kempson at a gym called Tagani Gym, and they would fly me over for, and stay for 2 weeks and fight for that gym. And so that was very, like at that time, that was very good money, like 2,000 US for a fight in Japan. So that would obviously last a very long time in Thailand. I had my own had my own little unit, very close to the camp. Jatui, I didn't pay any training fees at Saengmorakot after my first month of training there. Like they really took me in, so it was really minimal spending while I was in Thailand. Unless someone from Perth would come over and visit me, and then we'd go out and do a few entertaining things.
Yeah, of course. Thailand can always be entertaining. And so, I mean, what was it like? I guess, did you feel pretty disconnected from Perth and Australian Muay Thai at the time? Because, there's obviously a big gap between the culture and communication.
Yeah, definitely. It was definitely some pretty lonely times. We refer to it as living the dream and stuff like that. But at the same time, it was still some very difficult, challenging times. With the communication. Obviously, like over time, my Thai got very good, but it's obviously still not quite the same.
Mm-hmm.
I would get occasional visits, and back then there wasn't like social media like now and connecting with people and just sending messages and stuff like that. It's communication basically. Because when you're away, you're a boxer living off your purses. Even phoning home and stuff like that is an expensive operation. So it's your communication tended to be emails, and that was about it.
Mm-hmm.
Sending some emails. So afternoon trip to the computer shop in the afternoon, sit down and have a drink and do a few emails and things like that. That was kind of your social network.
Yeah, the internet cafes are still here, but they're not quite as prevalent anymore.
Yeah.
I definitely, again, I remember like early on walking to internet cafes and looking at gyms online or emailing people, and definitely different times. And this was only 10, 15 years ago versus 20 years with you. So you were at Saengmorakot for 2 years or so, and then when did you transition back into Australia, and why did you decide to do that?
Well, it was actually more like 3 years at Saengmorakot, plus about 6 months in Japan as well. So it was a good frame, good amount of time that I got to spend there. And even during that time, there was a couple of times that I got flown home to fight, because I was from Perth and Phon, and that area was doing very big shows. He actually, and his connection with Jatui, he actually brought me back to Perth a couple of times to fight. So I would train for it in Thailand, and then fly home, fight, and then a couple of days later, then fly back to Thailand. So that was a great experience to be able to do that. And obviously well needed.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So that was sort of around 2000 at that time.
Mm-hmm. And then you permanently relocated back to Perth, though, correct?
Yeah.
As always, if you'd like to follow me, you can do so on Instagram, Matt Lucas Muay Thai. I always respond to messages there. I also have the website, matt-lucas.com, or email me at a.matt.lucas@gmail.com. Thanks to all the people that have supported me so far, sharing the podcast, leaving reviews. If you'd like to leave a review, that would be super helpful. You can do so on the iTunes stores. After years of hard work, studying, and being in the game, I published I'm Fighting in Thailand, a guide to the sport in the motherland. Is a Muay Thai encyclopedia. Goes over scoring, matchmaking, picking gym, fight styles, gambling, Muay Thai culture, and more. It contains a series of interviews with long-term expat fighters, including Michael Savas, Willie Whipple, Lisa Brealey, Angela Chang, and others. It is a great guide, educates and helps guide careers by helping save fighters from costly mistakes. It is a definitive guide and is available on Amazon as an ebook and in print. So go check it out. On Fighting in Thailand, a guide to the sport in the motherlands.
Yeah, I relocated back to the Perth, and then I started to plan for the future. Even when I was living in Thailand, obviously you've got a lot of time sort of between training sessions, and you're trying to rest and recover. You're not so much getting out to the shops and looking around doing the tourist thing when you've been there for a long time. It's thinking about recovery for your afternoon training session. So I spent a lot of time planning and making notes and things like that. Like, I knew fairly early on that I wanted to teach Muay Thai and wanted to make it my career afterwards. And so I very early started planning and jotting down notes about, ideas for names of the gym and curriculum and structure and things like that. Planning for the future.
So when was it that you first started opening your gym? Like, I know you had students and you would train them in the evenings, and you were also sort of actively fighting at the same time. And then, inevitably the students were fighting more. You decided to go that path. But just in terms of time span, when was that?
Yep. So that was, I opened my gym in 2003.
Mm-hmm.
2003. Getting things moving for the future, and my focus was on trying to train students and just have members come and train at the gym, and then train with a small group of fighters that would train with me also. So it was a way for me to keep my fight career going, or at least wind it down for a couple of years while I was building the gym up. So I was sort of getting the best of both worlds, and sort of two sort of little incomes coming in that way to help it get by.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it flourished quite quickly because I was still fighting and doing well at that time. The name of the gym spread very quickly. I had some fighters come to me that were already established, and so they became, morning training partners. And then I was able to just concentrate freely on training beginners classes and stuff like that in the evening times, and try and build up and do a few PTs during the daytime. That, like I said, I had a couple of experienced fighters come to me. Chris Tiger White, who was had already won a WKN world title in Poland. Eugene Eckelboom, who was already WMC world champion, he had won it previously. Came to train with me also, so I had some really good training partners from very early on, and I just made that natural progression from caring about my own training solely to naturally not just sharing what I knew and what I was doing, but more focused on their preparation and things like that. Like I was holding pads up until the final training session, and then on a fight show, I'd do the corner for 2 or 3 or 4 of my fighters before I got to my own fight.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously I didn't have a trainer. It was the team training me, and I had my mate Brett Dalton would often help me with the corner and things like that, just to help me during the fight. So, and old training partners.
Yeah.
So, not really getting that direction and structure of having a coach telling you what to do. And so I guess that helped me with my own coaching experience and skill from very early on also.
And then, so when did you decide to start coaching full time, and what was the Muay Thai scene like in Australia? You said Phon was putting on regular shows. How often were they? How big were these shows? What was sort of going on with the larger community?
Okay. Yeah, in Perth, the Bob Jones Corporation, they were doing regular regular fight shows like every couple of months. I mean, it's nothing like it is now. So back in those days in the 90s, there was the BJC. They were doing, say, maybe 4 shows a year. Phon was maybe doing like a couple from memory, a couple a year. He went through a period where he developed that a lot more around the 2000s and stuff like that. He did more than that, but very early on, like early 90s and mid 90s, he did some massive shows at Burswood with sort of 2,000 plus people, which was huge for Muay Thai. You know, back in that day especially, but even now in Perth, you know, for a Perth crowd. And he was bringing over superstar Thais. Like he brought over, he did one show which really gave me direction for the style that I wanted to go, and it was a large part of the reason why I started going to Thailand. He brought over superstar Thais of the golden era, Namkabun, Namkapay, Sangtiak Noi, all those kinds of guys, which were like this. You know, people still watch them now. They're like legends of the sport. So to see them actually live back then, Coburn 40 Perth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So just incredible, you know, created and made a hell of an impact on me, and for that Thai style is what I really wanted to do. So that, again, that throughout the course of the year, that wasn't a huge number of fight shows, which also sort of pushed me to the point that, I was sometimes only getting 1 or 2 fights in a year in that early part, because of obviously not the pool, the talent pool back then, and there was, you know, a lot less interstate fights and those kinds of things. Our promoters weren't just going to fly in someone for you to fight like what happens commonly now. So I kind of got to the stage I was in doing door work and those kinds of things so that I could train a lot. Got to the stage where I was like, all right, what do I want to do with this? Do I want to go and make something of this, or do I just want to, you know, stay in Perth and work doors and have an occasional fight and not be at my best? Because sometimes even that would be might be 2 fights in a year, and you might only get 3 weeks notice. So if you weren't already good prep, good condition, it was going to be a battle.
Right. So what was it like opening the gym and really transitioning into being a full-time coach? You know, what was running the business like at the time? Was it difficult for you to transition from fighter to business owner?
Yeah, it was obviously an exciting time. I was obviously learning on the fly. Phon back then in Perth, Phon was pretty much the only person that was making a living out of teaching Muay Thai, having a Muay Thai gym. He was a big inspiration. His gym was very, very busy back then. Over in Melbourne, Mark Castanini was, you know, a full-time gym. He was doing the BJC sort of Muay Thai, and some martial arts and stuff like that as well. So I took inspiration from him as well with curriculum and how he structured things. So I kind of felt like I was finding my way a lot with those things. But again, I just went back to all those plans that I had made, thinking about how to teach the basics of Muay Thai, how to break down things, learning drills and things like that, and how to pass that on to people that just want to train it for fun and fitness, not necessarily to compete, but, you know, to keep the true nature of Muay Thai, not watering things down or fluffing them down or anything like that to make them appealing, but actually still teach the real Muay Thai, and the structure of my gym is still very much about that now. Like we teach real Muay Thai, real skills throughout the classes, the beginners classes, the intermediate classes, right into my fight team. We do lots of drills and things like that. Yeah, in terms of learning business, it was very much on the fly. So yeah, it was very much learning on the fly. But I just, like I said, I went back to having some structure. And my biggest thing with business was just treating people how I wanted to be treated.
Mm. And then Perth has become a real hotbed for the sport now. How has it changed over time? Like, when did more gyms start coming in, and in general in the Australian Muay Thai scene?
Yeah, look, WA Muay Thai, the Perth Muay Thai is just, it's so strong. It's so good here. Like the level of the fighters coming out, from the trainers, because it's my generation of trainer now, the guys that have had fights and been to Thailand and done tournaments and, had locally and internationally had a lot of fights. There's gyms, even now there's new gyms opening up all the time, and they're not, they're not cowboy, they're not idiots. The majority of them are guys with experience or retired fighters that have decided to open up. One of my former fighters, Eugene Eckelboom, 7 times world champion, he's been training people for several years now. He was partnered with Fierce Fight Academy, but he's just gone out on his own and started his own last year. Another well-known Perth fighter, James Bertolami, he's gone out on his own and opened up Monsters Inc. So we've got all these new gyms coming up and from experienced fighters. So just the level is awesome now in Perth. And a large part of that, a big part of that is the culture, the Thai culture, the sportsmanship, the friendliness, the camaraderie. The WA Muay Thai is in a really, really good place at the moment. Really good.
And how has your coaching and training changed over time, and what sort of influence have you had over it, or what has influenced you?
My main changes that I've made is sort of, obviously you kind of evolve things a little bit, as you learn things or try them. Probably the main changes I've made in terms of training for my fighters and things like that is adjusting the volume and things like that from my own experiences. In hindsight, looking back at my time in Thailand, there was never a time that I went into a fight where I wasn't overtrained, unless I took it on really short notice. And remembering that feeling and how I felt. And so and keeping in mind also that everybody over here, majority of people work full-time or at least part-time and study and things like that, so they have a lot of other things on their plate. So to keep that same sort of volume and training that you do in Thailand is not realistic at all. So, I have made big changes with volume. We do a great taper, we call it, the last week prior to the fight here. I call it taper week, and we're cutting down the sessions each day, reducing their volume of training. Another big change I've made is adding in sort of like some more intense, so rather than just long and steady and arduous like the Thailand style, we do a lot of short, sharp stuff. We do some 40-second rounds of pads where you're really working at a high intensity rate, and we also do some sprinting, like Tabata sprinting, 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, those kinds of things, develop that high end power and energy output. Really get the engine firing, gets you super fit, rather than just always long and steady. I've incorporated in strength and conditioning for years now, probably close to 10 years. Always learning and implementing about those things. I still train every day myself. I do Muay Thai, hit pads 1 to 2 times a week. Obviously, I hold pads very physically every day, and I do strength and conditioning and some CrossFit style stuff literally every day.
Yeah.
So always learning, always evolving, always tweaking.
And can you talk about some of your more present notable fighters? I'm personally more familiar with like Tyler Hardcastle, who had a great bout with Saengmorakot on Rebellion a little while ago, and then of course George Mann, who won the WBC bout against David Panapid. Can you talk about like some of the more present fighters you've developed, both male and female?
Yes, the present ones, as you mentioned already, George Mann has come to Perth probably about 4 or 5 years ago now. He's been at Riddler's Gym almost 3 years now. Love having him. He's got a wealth of experience. He's a wonderful guy. Really generous with his technique and experience that he has. Always shares it with his training partners and stuff like that. Tyler Hardcastle, who's been with me since he was 15 years old, have had obviously a long history with him. Recently retired Alicia Pastana. She's been around for a very long time. Obviously a female fighter. She was a WK world champion many years ago, and she retired as the current WMC Australian champion a couple of times.
She was out here recently, or a year or two ago for IFMA,
Yes.
Correct? Yeah, I met her
correct.
out here. I remember her. I was wondering what had happened with her and where she'd gone.
Yeah, she decided to retire because she wanted to start a family, and she is about to give birth very soon. So she's pregnant with a son. He's going to be coming very soon.
That's good.
Another really well-known fighter of mine, especially in Australia, was the Nightmare Lloyd Dean.
Oh, right.
He was a great name. Had a lot of really good battles with a lot of ties. He had a number of really good fights and wins on Rebellion. But he just sort of out of the blue just decided that he'd had enough. Just over a year ago now, year and a half, he fought Duke here, and he fought Saengmorakot on the Yokkao show, and he just decided he'd had enough. He was a very hard-working guy, so I think it was very grueling for him to work as an electrician and train hard like he did. He had a solid number of fights in a period of time, and I think it just built up on him, and he just decided that he'd had enough. Yeah. So that was a shame. But he certainly established himself. Nicola Calander, who you met at Muay Thai Angels many years ago, one of my up-and-coming female fighters. When I say up-and-coming, she's 14 fights now. Megan Burberry, she's the current Muay Thai Australia and WBC state champion. So she's got a very promising future. She's very focused, very determined young fighter. So we're all going to be seeing big things from her in the next couple of years. Yeah.
Good to hear. And so I guess moving gears a little bit into the past again, how did, a lot of things have come out of Australian Muay Thai, like the Evolution shows, the One Warrior shows, more recently Rebellion, and International Kickboxer. How do these sort of things shape the sport in the country?
Well, they helped shape the sport immensely in terms of International Kickboxer magazine, which was initially Blitz magazine. Mark Hammer-Casamini had a lot to do with that. Obviously, the formation and the management of International Kickboxer magazine, gaining the exposure for the fighters. Back then there was not the social media like now, and the International Kickboxer magazine was really our Bible, so to speak. We just used to live and hang out for that magazine to find out fight results, from 2 months prior and things like that. Whereas now, like during the show or an hour after the show, if you don't know the results, you're barely interested. But I just remember just hanging for it to coming in the mail, and just sit down and literally read it from cover to cover. And anyone that was trying to establish the gyms would advertise in the magazine and support the magazine. So that had a massive development and exposure for the shows. Mark Hammer had a lot to do with the exposure to the Evolution shows in Queensland put on by Nugget Josh Sexton. Had a lot to do with their exposure on Fox Sports to, the names of the fighters that became household names: Carnage, John Wayne Parr, Preacher, all those guys, due to regular showing on Fox Sports, which was awesome.
Yeah. And then I guess more recently, what are some of the big shows in Australia? Like, I'm most familiar with Rebellion. What does the landscape sort of look like now?
Rebellion has really done amazing things the last couple of years. Sai puts on and has put on really big fights that he wants to see. He's a massive fan of the sport, and if he's a big fan of Superstar Thai or somebody like that. Like he wants to put on the fights that he wants to see. So he's done incredible things for it in the last couple of years, and has been largely responsible for the growth of Muay Thai in Victoria, which were very kickboxing and K1 rules heavy state. He's had a lot to do with the development of Muay Thai there. Knees of Fury in Adelaide, Ethan Shep promoting of Paul Slawinski, the Sting, early on, late 90s, 2000s, multiple times WMC world champion. Again, another show that was on Fox Sports regularly. I had a lot of fighters on those shows as well. And locally in Perth, myself and Kaylee's done the epic shows over previous years, and Supremacy prior to that, and Domination, doing really big things here and regularly as well. Very new to the scene, the Muay Thai Grand Prix guys, doing really good shows already. They've done 3 shows now, and they're doing great shows so far. So it's really helping the Perth scene. My good friend Paul Demicoli is up in, obviously he had a lot to do with Ultimate Promotions, which were largely kickboxing, K1 rules back in the day in Victoria. He's now up in Queensland. He does the great show Eruption up there, which is all Muay Thai now. So he's had a large part of development for a lot of fighters and shows.
And I guess just sort of wrapping things up, how do you feel Australian Muay Thai has changed over, the last 10, 15 years?
In 10 to 15 years, the main changes has been the development of the fighters, the skill set. Obviously, the knowledge and the skill set is increasing because of the trainers. Like I said, it's on the 2nd or 3rd generation of trainers and fighters now, and people that were fighters like myself who've been going to Thailand, had a bunch of fights, are now passing on those skills. Plus we're still learning from being coaches. So the skill set of the fighters now is just incredible. Like my intermediate level fighters and some of my fighters that go into fight, like honestly, the way they fight, they look like they've had 5 fights, and the guys that have had 5 fights look like they've had 10 fights. It's incredible, the skill set and level of the fighters, and these guys aren't having to make mistakes or find their way like the trainers did, like myself did, and all the other generation of trainers like Blair Smith, Darren Riddler Reece, Adam Bailey, like we all had to make. They're getting our experience passed straight to them. So that's the main change I can see. And on the scene, there's a lot better understanding of the culture. It's a lot more cultural now. The respect for Muay Thai, the Ramoys, the nature of the fighters, like the Perth scene especially, and even people from interstate, when they come over, they say, I just can't believe how friendly everyone is over here, like at the weigh-ins, opponents or previous opponents are talking to one another, and just everyone is so friendly, and that we put that down to the culture of Muay Thai now. It's not just about ego and actual fighting, but it's a culture of like true Muay Thai. Whereas back 15, 20 years ago, it was sort of like the gyms weren't influenced by the Thai culture. And so it was very much about actual fighting and ego and wanting to beat that gym or wanting to beat that fighter. Whereas now a lot of the trainers are happy to just have a great matchup and for the fighters to show brilliant skills and things like that.
Great. And so wrapping things up, was there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
The biggest disappointment for me is obviously just the lack of mainstream media exposure that Muay Thai gets and that our fighters get. Like, we all know about it. We all know, and the fighters know, they're not going to make thousands or become millionaires out of Muay Thai, so they're simply doing it for the passion and the sport of actually learning and doing Muay Thai. That is kind of disappointing, just that the mainstream media just won't show that interest in it or come around, and that continues to be sort of like my main disappointment. That Muay Thai not getting the recognition that it deserves, especially when you look at the popularity of UFC and the style of the fights, and even like in UFC, the most popular fighters and the most popular fights are the stand-up fights, and the ones that stand there punching and kicking, and they talk about the effectiveness of the low kicks and the locking on clinch, the Thai elbows. They always talk about those things, but it doesn't carry over into the growth of the support for Muay Thai. The people in Muay Thai love Muay Thai, but we don't seem to be getting more and more people come over to it. Our shows are sort of still similar styles, sizes, and we went through a great growth period years ago when Muay Thai was regularly on Fox Sports, but we lost a lot of that exposure with the growth of UFC and MMA. They took our Muay Thai slots on Foxtel, and with that they lost my subscription.
Well, hopefully in the future we can change things, little by little, doing things like this. We'll see what happens. But how can people follow along with you? Where's good places to follow along with the gym and some of the fighters?
Yeah, probably the best place to follow along is on Instagram. Riddler's Gym is probably the best place to find us, and I always try to get the results up of my fighters and promote the fight shows that I'm putting my fighters on and all those kinds of things. So it's my site isn't just about Muay Thai, but we do put a lot of Muay Thai stuff up. So I love sharing information about my fighters, upcoming fights, and the results after the fights as soon as I can. And lots of post-fight photos. So yeah, definitely Riddler's Gym on Instagram, and that's obviously connected to our Facebook page too.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Darren. I really appreciate it.
Matt, thank you very much for the opportunity and wanting to speak to me. I really appreciate it.
That was a great interview with Darren. I think he really brings a lot of experience and knowledge to the table. Obviously, he brought a lot of it back to Australia, and I think that's really one of the reasons why Australia and Perth in particular has really developed its Muay Thai scene. It's people coming out here to Thailand for extended periods of time and returning home. They're maintaining the connections out here in Thailand, but they're also bringing a lot of knowledge and information back with them. So I really applaud Darren for coming out here and staying for so long. It's definitely not easy. Looking forward to doing some more interviews. Hopefully, we'll be interviewing Kaylee Reece soon and a couple others in the Australian Muay Thai scene. Thank you, as always, for listening. And once again, if you like this show and if you like the content, it would be great if you could share, leave a review on iTunes, and really support the show and what I'm doing here. If you'd like to reach me, you can follow me on Instagram at Lucas Muay Thai or email me at a.matt.lucas@gmail.com. As always, this has been On Fighting in Thailand, the best news and analysis covering the economics and infrastructure of Muay Thai. I'm Matt Lucas, journalist, commentator, and ex-Muay Thai fighter. Make stronger fighters, make stronger people.
This show was edited by Effie Ceruti. You can find me on Instagram at Effie_FC or on Facebook at Effie Ceruti.